Now we're going to talk about our Holeshot device on our Yamaha 450. I actually went into Chaparral's parts room and was looking around and ran across a start button that I would like to put on the bike. This is a start button that comes to us from Tamer Holeshot buttons. They are the patent holder of the start device. Well, this actual type of device. But Fly Racing distributes this. And the reason I chose it is because you have two different settings. You can set your start button at, let's say, 100 millimeters. 100 millimeters is about normal, what most people set their start device at. And then you have another start button, which would be 135 millimeters. Or you could do it the other way, which you could set your bottom start device at 100 millimeters, and then the other one would be 75 millimeters, 70 millimeters, something like that. So it gives you options when you're on the starting gate and you roll up to the line. It's a dirt start and you have a sticky starting spot, or you have a hard packed one. Then you can adjust your start button right there on the fly. It's a simple process. You just set the button wherever you want it. You have 35 millimeters that you can adjust between. I think it's a pretty trick piece. I've never seen one. I just found it in Chaparral parts counter. So we're going to try it on our Yamaha. The fork ring is nice. It's really simple to get the button hooked into. It fits the diameter of the fork slider, obviously. And one more feature that it comes with is a pattern that you can cut your fork guard with. You just tape this on, make a couple marks, do your drilling, and it's a fairly simple process with a pattern. When you don't have a pattern, it's sometimes a nightmare. But with this, it'll make our installation job pretty darn easy. How you guys doing today? We're down here in the Chaparral shop. We are going to install the Fly Racing Holeshot device, made and patented by Tamer. It's a little bit of a job. You got to take your front wheel and fork guard off. Let's get to it and I'll show you what to do. First, you're going to want to loosen your pinch bolts that hold the front axle on. They're 10 millimeter heads. You can just use a wrench or a ratchet, something you can get on it easily, and loosen those a little bit. Next, we'll move over to the disc side of the bike, and you'll want to grab a 22 wrench and loosen the nut that holds your axle. You don't want to loosen the pinch bolts first because then the axle will just spin. So loosen the nut and then you can loosen your pinch bolts on the disc side. And just quickly turn that. Now you can take your nut completely out and push your axle, hold your front wheel, pull the axle out, front wheel drop straight out. Next, we're going to loosen the bolts that hold the fork guard on. They're 4 millimeter Allens, and there's 3 of them. You're going to want to just work around the bottom of the fork guard and take all those loose. I'm not taking them completely out. I'm just backing them out a ways because when we slide the fork out of the triple clamp, we'll take the fork guard off completely then. Now we're going to want to loosen our pinch bolts that hold the fork. Just crack it loose, rotate it 3 or 4 times, and then move up to the top triple clamp and loosen the bottom one And I leave the top one tightened until I can get a hold of the fork. And now I'm going to loosen the top one just so the fork doesn't slide out unexpectedly. This is not going to, so that's a good thing. And then just rotate your fork back and forth and it'll slide right out. Now that we have our fork on the workbench, we've taken it off the bike and placed it on the workbench. We're just going to take those bolts out, those Allens that we had taken loose on the motorcycle, and we'll just back those out completely. Before we take our last bolt out, we're going to want to place a mark on the top side of the fork guard at the bottom of the slider. Just make sure that the holes are lined up where we've taken the other bolts out, just so we can get an accurate mark on here. And just put a tiny little mark at the base on the fork guard, but the base of the slider. So we've got our fork guard laying on the workbench by itself, and we have our mark where we know that the bottom of the slider, the fork slider is. What the mark is for is we're actually going to measure down from there to know where the start button needs to be. From testing and things that we've done in the past, we know that 100 millimeters is about the average location. 100 millimeters down, collapsing the fork down, works about the best, we've figured. But some riders like it a little lower, some riders like it a little higher, and truly, depending on the dirt and the track conditions on the starting line, that's going to determine where your start button needs to be. But in this case, with the fly start button, we've got 2 points where the buttons can be. So let's say this one can be set at 100 millimeters fork collapsed, and then if you put it on the second button, then it's going to be 135 millimeters fork collapse. So honestly, that's why I chose this button, is because you have a dual button and you're able to choose where you want it. So what we're going to do is we're going to place the 100 millimeters right in the middle, and so then this button will be at 115 millimeters collapse, and this button's going to be at about about 85 millimeters collapsed. So then you can choose between the two and have the best of both worlds. We're going to use the template that Fly Racing has provided to us. What the template is a negative of the start device, and it shows you where the holes all need to be that are going to be drilled in the fork guard. What you need to find is where the center, or where you're going to locate your start button, and we're going to put ours actually right in the middle of the fork guard. And so we need to measure down 100 millimeters from our mark that we have on the fork guard, and that's going to be 100 millimeters. Well, we better do this. We better just put a line right there so we know where it is, right at the base. And now we can put our template right there. So the way that I'm going to keep this straight, and I'm going to keep it at the middle point of the fork guard, is I just lay the fork guard on the bench and lay the template in place, and then you can see that it's right on the radius of the fork guard. So we're going to get it in the center and keep it straight so it looks good on the bike. And then we're going to tape it down to the fork guard, and we're going to work through the tape, drilling our holes through the tape and through the fork guard. Pretty simple process. You just need to peel your, and definitely use masking tape. Masking tape seems like it works the best. Just your painter's masking tape, simple stuff. You can get it at Home Depot, wherever. And just lay your tape right over the top of the template, And you're going to want to make sure, we're going to use another piece of tape also, maybe even a few. Make sure this doesn't go anywhere. And just lay your tape down. Doesn't have to be crazy tight or anything. Just make sure that your template's not going to move when you're working on it. Okay. Before you drill your holes, push down on your tape so that you could see the indentation of where the holes are, just to make sure you get your holes in the correct place. And we're going to drill our center hole first. Push through the tape, make sure your drill's straight. And there's hole number 1. Now we're going to move to the top of the fork guard. Push through the tape. Make sure your hand's out of the way. 2. And we'll get our third hole here. Push through the tape. And there you go. Now that we have our holes drilled, we're going to take the screws that come with the kit and a Phillips screwdriver, and we're just going to screw them through the template into the plastic to hold the template in place, because we're going to remove the tape at this point. You don't want to over tighten it, just get it so it snugs up against the template. The bottom of the head of the screw snugs up against the template. Do the same with the top hole. And now we'll move to the bottom hole, doing the same thing. Now our template will hold in place just by threading it through there. Now we can remove the tape. Now we're ready to drill our holes where the buttons come through the fork guard. And they're a little bit larger, as you can see from the template. So we're going to use a bit that is going to be able to drill right through that and to that size. And we'll start with the bottom hole this time. And go slowly, because once you go through, it takes off. And it'll hit up against that metal template. You'll feel it. Now we'll do the same with the top hole. Now that we're done drilling the holes, we're going to get rid of our template. And that's just by taking these 3 screws out. Ninja reflexes. And now we can deburr our holes through the fork guard. Now what we're going to do, since we have our template off and all 5 holes drilled, take your drill and just set it on your workbench facing upwards to the ceiling. And I'm going to take my fork guard, and as you can see, there's some plastic that has been left there. I'm just going to turn my drill on and manually just lay the guard down on here. Now we have all 5 holes drilled and somewhat deburred. You're going to want to get a deburring tool or a knife, one or the other. This seems like it works the best. And just clean up around those holes. Make sure you're getting everything off so you don't have plastic getting between your button and your fork. And do that on both large holes. Now we're going to turn it over and do the same to the outside of the fork guard. And it's pretty clean over here, so you're don't want to get crazy on it. You just want to kind of just deburr it. Just make sure your stuff's off of it. As you can see, you're leaving little niches, but you're never going to see those. It's better to have it clean and no plastic there than these little marks on there. Now that we have our large holes deburred, we're going to move to our small holes, and on the outside we're just going to take an X-Acto knife and carefully clean these up just to make sure that our start button is going to lay flush on the fork guard. And get it as clean as you can. Now we're going to do the same with the back side of the fork guard, and we're just going to clean these little plastic fur and get those out of there, just so our screws sit tightly to the fork guard. And then do it with the other 2 holes once you get one done. You're going to want to get some blue Loctite. We're going to put that in the threaded holes on the start button. You don't want to put it on your screws because you screw the screws through the plastic, and when you do that, it'll take the Loctite off the screws. So put it in your holes and it'll make it a whole lot easier. Now that we have everything prepared, we're going to take our start button, lay it in our hand, take our fork guard that has already been drilled, we're going to lay it on top of that start button and line all your holes up. Now we're going to take our screw and we're going to push it in just to hold it in place there. Then take our Phillips screwdriver and thread it through there, the plastic fork guard. And it will start threading itself into the start button. And now we'll do the same with the other 2 screws. Doesn't matter if you start with the top or the bottom. After the first one's in place, just push it in there. Take your Phillips screwdriver, thread it straight in. And you'll feel it start into the start button when it gets through the plastic. Don't wrench down on it hard. We're just kind of snugging them up right now. Make sure that everything's straight. We'll do the same with the top screw. Okay, now that we have these snugged up, now you can just flip your fork guard over and take a look at everything. Okay, everything's in place. Now we're going to tighten her down. And let's start with the middle first. And kind of let that countersink head push itself into the plastic. Try to get the screw as flush as you can with the plastic. You don't want it to be sticking up and catch your fork. Move to the next screw and do the same with it. Sink it into the plastic. Now we're going to move to the bottom and last screw and do the same with it. Make sure the countersink head goes into the plastic and the top of the bolt is flush with the plastic itself. Let me just tell you one thing, that if the screw is sticking up above the plastic, when your fork slider goes up and down here, it's going to catch these bolts and destroy this part of your fork slider. So you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that everything's clean and nice and is flush as possible. So just saying that, we'll give it another turn. So now we'll take it and we'll look down the fork guard to make sure that everything is flush and countersunk into the plastic. So we've got our screws in place and flush, fairly flush. Now we'll flip it over and make sure that we've got cleaned up a bit. And you can see everything is in place. Buttons work properly. And now we can move on and put the ring on the fork slider. So we're going to use the screw that you bleed the air up from the fork. I run those screws and they come standard from the manufacturer in the forward position, facing forward. So we're going to use that as center and forward. And we are going to actually take our starting device, the part that goes onto the fork, and we're going to put where those buttons lock into it, and we're going to face that forward using this as center forward. And then you could just slide it straight onto the fork. Now that we've got our start device ring down on the bell of the fork slider, we're going to push it up against the lock ring that they have. It sits right in a groove, and you want to push your start device ring down on it, and then take your 3mm Allen and snug up the bolt on your start device ring. Next step is to put your fork guard back onto the fork. So we will lay it in place, try to center it on your holes. Take your bolts that you've sat next to it and just start them right into the hole. They're self-centering, they have a shoulder on them. So now that we have everything assembled onto the fork leg itself, we're going to take the fork leg, slide the fork slider back into place in the triple clamps, and we're going to put it at the base of the fork cap at the top of the triple clamp. That's where we have our other one. And make sure that our bleed hole is in the front. Now we can tighten these pinch bolts. And remember to reference your manuals, owner manual, so you know the exact torque. We're just going to snug these up. I can get them pretty close right now, but I will be going back and torquing them later. So you viewers at home, please reference your manual and get the correct torque when you do end up tightening these pinch bolts for good. Now that we have our fork leg back on our bike, we're going to roll our front wheel back in place and have your axle on hand. Lift the front wheel, slide the disc into the brake pads, and then slide your axle straight in. Now take your nut and thread it by hand up tight. Give it a little snug. Before we tighten all of our bolts and nuts, axle, everything down tight, we've got it kind of snugged up, and now we're going to work the suspension back and forth a little bit just to kind of get the fork lugs to set and align itself. So the way I do it is I grab the front tire, put the front tire onto the ground, grab the crossbar, and then just kind of work it back and forth, rolling the tire back into the bike. Now we're going to tighten our pinch bolts on the opposite side of the disc first, and just tighten that down. Reference your owner's manual for the right torque spec on these. Now we'll move to the other side. Now I'm going to tighten the axle nut. The reason I tightened the lug on the other side was to hold the axle in place while I tighten this nut. Give that a good little snug. And now I'm going to tighten this lug pinch bolts on the disc side. One thing you need to make sure before you tighten everything down is that this dish that is dished out in the start device ring aligns with the start buttons, because these buttons drop into that dish right there, that dished out piece, and that's what keeps the fork down. So just make sure, align it down from the top of the fork looking down, and make sure that these buttons align with that dished out piece. And last but not least, we're going to take our 3 Allen and we are going to tighten the start device ring up on the fork slider. Everything's aligned. We want to get this snugged up so it's not going to go anywhere. You don't want it rotating while we ride or between rides. Give it a snug, and everything's tightened up. So we've just wrapped up and finished putting our Fly Racing start device on. As you saw, it wasn't that difficult. You know, you have to take your front wheel off one of the fork legs, but you know, getting the template taped on and the holes drilled, everything's pretty simple and straightforward. I didn't really have to take any shortcuts or anything to cut any time. Everything was pretty efficient. So we got it done, and I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget, there are 3 ways that you can order here at Chaparral. You can call our 800 number, which is 800-841-2960. Go to our website, chapmoto.com, or just come on into our store and you'll be able to order whatever you need.